Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing really, really well, and go and get that perfect drink, whatever it is that you enjoy drinking, coffee, cocoa. If it's something cool and refreshing, go and get it, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, Mrs. Joubert sat in her car, her fingers trembling, her heart thumping in her chest. She couldn't believe what she'd just seen. She would never have believed it unless she had seen it with her own eyes. There was no doubt in her mind. She wasn't mistaken. What do I do? She asked herself. I can't sit back and do nothing about it. I have to tell Chantal Feeney. I know I'm not good friends with the woman, but everyone deserves to know the truth, don't they? Mrs. Joubert sighed wearily. Over the years she had developed a reputation for being the town busybody. She didn't like being so unfairly labelled. She couldn't help it that she was so quick-witted, astute, and as sharp as a tack. Evidently other people went through life rather like blind mice, never detecting a thing, being unwittingly impercipient and unheedingly inobservant, while Mrs. Joubert was as sharp as a bald eagle, and proud of it too. It was thanks to Mrs. Joubert's savvy perception that the spate of robberies that occurred in the neighbourhood of late had ground to a halt, for it was Mrs. Joubert herself who recognised one of the robbers, a young boy from a neighbouring town, who was involved with a very unfortunate group of boys running away from a robbery at the next-door neighbour's house. She had detected him, and it was thanks to her ingenious eye for detail and photographic memory that the young men had been arrested and prosecuted. It was so typical, she thought. People could be incredibly ungrateful. Mrs. Joubert pressed down the accelerator of her car and did a swift three-point turn in the asphalt road, driving towards the leafy green neighbourhood that she was very proud to call home. It had been a beautiful day, she thought. Too bad it had to be soured and tarnished by the bad news that she was about to convey to Chantal Feeney. The neighbourhood looked so pretty in the late afternoon, with the soft ethereal shadows of sunlight now fading and dimming, while the blue sky receded. It was now painted in an undulating ocean of golds, orange and pinks, to announce the arrival of the soon-to-be evening, that was now eagerly waiting in the wings to glaze the burnished sky in dark black tones of night. A soft breeze was blowing, so that the honey locust trees on either side of the road were swaying gracefully like dignified, elegant ballet dancers. Mrs. Joubert had lived in this neighbourhood for 20 long years. She was proud to call it home. She knew everyone living here on a first-name basis, and what she didn't know was not worth knowing at all, for she knew the comings and goings of the street like no other. She knew Mr. Rogers at number 46 got up at 4:30 every morning to take his dog Bobo for his morning walk, and that Mrs. van der Berg always went to town for her hairdressing appointment at 2:30 on Wednesday to be precise. She parked her car on the side of the street, pulled up her handbrake, drew in a deep breath, climbed out of her car, slamming the door behind her, and marching over the perfectly mown lawn of the Feeney's front yard, onto the red brick path, up the terracotta steps, to the gleaming navy-blue front door of the pretty symmetrical home with its grey slate roof, blue shutters, and wide French windows. Chantal was surprised to hear the knock at the front door. It was late in the afternoon. It was not common for her to have visitors this late in the day. She quickly trotted over to the door and opened it. Mrs. Joubert, the town busybody, was standing there in the doorway. If there was anyone she would least like to see, it was Mrs. Joubert. She smiled politely at the sylph-like figure of Mrs. Joubert, always so elegantly attired. This afternoon was of course no exception. She was wearing a very stylish blue A-line skirt and a pale blue cashmere sweater, with a short string of pearls around her neck, and flat blue ballet pumps graced her feet. Her brown highlighted hair was so neatly brushed away from her face, and Chantal couldn't help noticing a flicker of sadness in Mrs. Joubert's brown eyes that normally twinkled with humour. "Hello, Ruth," said Chantal. "Now this is a surprise. Can I come in, dear?" said Mrs. Joubert. "I need to speak to you about a very delicate matter, if I may. It's of extreme importance." "Of course," said Chantal, opening the door. "Can I offer you a glass of white wine? I've just opened a bottle." "Sounds lovely, dear." Chantal led Mrs. Joubert into the living room, and noticed the woman was twitching nervously, and taking several gulps of the white wine she had handed her, as if to steady her nerves. She had never seen Mrs. Joubert so shaken before. She found herself feeling empathetic towards the poor woman, who seemed distinctly uncomfortable and restlessly ill at ease, as if she'd rather be anywhere else in the world than in Chantal's living room right now. "Are you sure you're all right, Ruth? You look very discomposed, almost as if you've had a nasty shock. I do believe you're trembling." "I'll be all right in a moment, Chantal," Mrs. Joubert assured her. "Now, I'm very aware of what people think about me in the community. I know people think I'm a prying, snooping busybody that puts my nose in everybody's business. But in truth, I'm just very sharp, very observant. I notice things others don't, which has often earned me more than a few enemies, shall we say. Well, I'll say this for you, Ruth. You're the best neighbourhood watch we could ever ask for, and that's a big compliment coming from me. What is it that's so delicate that you want to talk to me about? You've got me rather intrigued. I saw something in town today, something that ruffled my feathers considerably. There's no easy way to say this, Chantal, dear. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but your husband Richard is having an affair with a woman who looks remarkably like you." Chantal burst out laughing. "Richard? Having an affair, Ruth? I think not. I don't think Richard would know how to have an affair. He hasn't got a licentious bone in his body." "This is no laughing matter," said Mrs. Joubert. "I saw your husband in town, Chantal, holding hands with a woman. It was definitely him. I'm certain I was not mistaken. I waved at him to show him I'd seen him. He gave me this blank look, pretended not to know me." The smile from Chantal's face faded. "But that's not possible. Richard's away on business in Canada." "I'm sorry, dear. I know it's hard to believe, but it was definitely Richard I saw in town. No question about it. I don't like to tell you this, but if it were me, I'd want to know." "Of course." Chantal was stamped. Her heart was thumping in her chest. Richard was her very best friend, as well as a husband for over 30 years. Their 2 children had left home. It was a bit late in the day for her husband to be having an affair. And Richard was not the adulterous, cheating type. He'd always been staunchly loyal. There must be some mistake, surely. "I am so sorry, Chantal," said Mrs. Joubert, whom looked genuinely upset. "I really didn't want to have to tell you this. Thank you so much, Mrs. Joubert, for coming." Once Mrs. Joubert had left the house, Chantal phoned the hotel in Canada with her cell phone, because if Richard was still in Canada, there was no possible way for Mrs. Joubert to have possibly seen him in town. It would affirm the woman's mistake as clear as day. Her heart sank when she was informed by the hotel that Richard had checked out earlier in the morning. What was going on? Had Richard returned home on an earlier flight? But even if that were the case, Richard would not be foolish enough to be holding hands with a woman in town when he was known by all the locals, as it would get back to her so fast that he was having an affair. Mrs. Joubert had been in no doubt about what she'd seen. What the heck was going on? Chantal was about to phone her husband's cell when she saw his familiar truck driving up her drive. She could see her husband slamming the door behind him, walking up the steps, wheeling his suitcase. Chantal stared at her husband's silhouette as it moved towards the house. Her mind was a whirl, her emotions spinning around the place like the clothes in a spin-dryer, going around and around. She didn't know what to think. Could her husband really be having an affair? The very idea made her nauseously sick to the stomach. She could hear the front door opening and closing, the footsteps of her husband, the sounds of his shoes squeaking on the polished terracotta tiles in the entrance hall. She could hear him throwing down his keys that jiggled in his hands onto the telephone table, and the thump of his suitcase as he left it in the entrance hall. She heard her husband calling her name. "Chantal!"
I'm back, Chantel."
Chantel did not answer her husband, but remained frozen to the spot like an ice statue.
"Chantel, Chantel, why didn't you answer me, honey?"
said her husband, staring at his wife in the living room, who was looking at him as if she was seeing a ghost. In his hands he was carrying a large, exquisite, very expensive bouquet of flowers. Suddenly Chantel felt very irate. She could feel the fury welling up in her chest like a volcano ready to spew its molten lava. It was the bouquet of flowers that had finally put the nails in her husband's coffin and ironed away any wavering doubts she may have had. She had learnt about infidelity on many of the programmes she listened to on the radio, about husbands placating and appeasing their shameful guilt by returning home to their wives with large bouquets of flowers. Richard, seeing his standoffish wife's indignant face, was rather perturbed at this uncordial, frosty reception he'd received. Furthermore, the expression she was wearing was like a belligerent, cranky, cantankerous bull terrier that was about to launch a full-scale attack on him. "You think this is funny?" said Chantel, grabbing the bouquet of flowers from her husband and pulling off the heads of the flowers so that the petals were flying around the room like confetti. Richard stared at his wife nonplussed. "You don't like the flowers?" he said, looking rather startled. "I thought they were rather beautiful myself." "It's not the flowers I don't like, Richard," said Chantel. "It's you I don't like. I don't like your treachery," she said, glaring at him with pugnacious, fractious blue eyes that were so wide they almost took up her entire face. Richard's face drained of colour, becoming as white as paper. "What's going on, Chantel? You're so confrontational, so hostile. You're acting very weird." "What's going on?" said Chantel, putting her hands on her hips defiantly. "Richard, please give me a little bit more credit. I'm not stupid. I know you checked out of your hotel in Canada this morning." "That's right, I did," said Richard. "I was coming home this evening, so I checked out of my hotel this morning. What's odd about that? I left my luggage in the hotel storage facility." "Mrs. Joubert told me what you did, Richard. She saw you in town holding a woman's hand."
"I know, Richard. I know you're having an affair."
Richard's face burst into a smile. He began to laugh.
"Chantel, are you crazy? You know I'd never cheat on you. Whatever Mrs. Joubert told you, it's definitely not true. I've only come in from Canada half an hour ago. You can check my flight details if you like. Look, I'll go and get them for you if you don't believe me."
Once Richard had shown Chantel the flight details, Chantel felt ashamed for doubting her husband's integrity. "I'm sorry, Richard. Mrs. Joubert said she saw you in town, holding a woman's hand. She was in no doubt about it. She said it was definitely you, but she must have been mistaken."
"Mistaken? Of course she was mistaken. For a start, Chantel, you're the love of my life. I'm surprised you would ever think that I could possibly cheat on you. The idea is nonsensical. I wouldn't even know how to have an affair with another woman. The idea of touching a woman that is not my wife gives me the creeps, quite frankly. Chantel, I'm disappointed that you would question my loyalty to you. Number two, do you think that if I was cheating on you, I would brazenly be holding hands with my new lover in town, so that nosy people like Mrs. Joubert would report back to you about my faithless affair? Credit me with a bit of intelligence, will you?"
"I'm sorry, honey," said Chantel, taking her husband into her arms lovingly, planting a reassuring kiss on his cheeks. "For a moment I really had my misgivings and umbrage about you. I don't know why. When you stood there with the flowers, you looked so smug. I suddenly got these terrifying images of you with another woman. I became completely enraged."
"Tell me about it," said Richard. "You scared me half to death, the way you reacted."
"Mrs. Joubert was so insistent she saw you in town. She said she was in no doubt that it was you. It's so bizarre. She's such a discerning woman."
"Sounds like I've got a double ganger," said Richard. The next morning, when Chantelle was bustling around her kitchen, making a delicious chocolate cake for Richard to make up for her unfair accusations, there was a knock at her door. It was her best friend Elsa, standing in the doorway, with red rims around her eyes. She looked dishevelled and very upset. "Elsa, you look dreadful. Please come in. I'll make you a cup of tea." She put her best friend down on a chair, busied herself putting the teapot on the gas hob, spooning the chocolate cake mix into 2 tins, and promptly putting them in the oven. Elsa was blowing her nose, wiping away tears, as well as staring vacantly into space. Chantelle had never seen her behave like this before, and wondered if her best friend had been involved in another Barney with her husband. Elsa had a tempestuous relationship with her husband, and there were times her friend would have blazing rows with him, where they wouldn't talk to each other for an entire week, and they would just sulk. A week later all would be forgiven and forgotten, and then they would make up. By all accounts they loved each other very much, but when they had fights all hell broke loose. But Elsa seemed particularly distressed this morning. Chantelle placed down a cup of tea in front of her friend. "You tell me what this is all about. Is it Robin? What has he done now?" "It's not Robin," said Elsa. "It's you. I saw Richard. He was with another woman in town. I don't know how to say this, Chantelle, but your husband's cheating on you." Chantelle began to laugh. "Dry up your tears, Elsa. You didn't see Richard. You saw his double-ganger, who looks a lot like him. You definitely didn't see him." "But it was Richard," insisted Elsa. "I saw him holding hands with another lady, a woman who looked just like you." "I promise you it wasn't him," Chantelle assured her. But Elsa did not look convinced. It was on a Saturday afternoon, when Chantelle was doing her shopping at the local grocery store, that she saw Richard standing in the store, reading the labels on the back of the bottles of wine. What was Richard doing, she thought, feeling frustrated. They were going to lunch that morning with the Stewarts. They were due there in an hour's time. They had to be quick in their shopping this morning. But Richard was dawdling. Richard was supposed to be picking up their dry cleaning. "Get a move on," she said, tapping Richard's shoulders. "For goodness sake, stop dawdling. Honestly, haven't you got anything better to do than to read the wine labels?" Richard turned around and looked at her, with an appalled look on his face. "Excuse me, madam, but if I want to read wine labels, I will. It's none of your business, and for your information, I'm definitely not dawdling." Chantelle could hardly believe it. The man she had mistaken for her husband was definitely not him, as his voice was distinctly different. But the man was identical to her husband, an exact carbon copy. She could hardly believe it. She was about to ask the man who he was, but he had disappeared. She shrugged her shoulders in disappointment. Now she knew why people thought her husband was having an affair. It would seem that a man who looked exactly identical to her husband was walking around town. How was that even possible? Richard was not adopted. He had no brothers or sisters. And yet there was a clone of her husband who looked identical to him. She couldn't comprehend how this was even remotely possible, unless her husband had an identical twin brother. That would be the only plausible explanation, surely. Perhaps Richard was adopted. Both brothers had gone to different homes. But if that were indeed the case, why had Richard's parents never revealed the truth to him? Did he not deserve to know if he was adopted, and if he had a twin brother? She decided privately that at the nearest opportunity she needed to visit Richard's parents to get to the bottom of this conundrum. So she decided not to tell Richard about her encounter with a man that looked identical to him. Even the clothes he was wearing, and his grey hair, looked very similar. It was more than a little bizarre. It was on a Monday morning that Chantelle drove to her mother-in-law's house. She wasn't certain how she was going to broach the subject about Richard with Gladys Feeney, who was a private woman. In fact, both Mr. and Mrs. Feeney were the most self-effacing, reticent, reserved, and evasive people she'd ever met, but they were utterly charming with it. Richard knew nothing about his parents' childhood, or anything about his own grandparents, whom he'd never met, as his parents never ever spoke about the past. He only knew his mother was not on speaking terms with her parents, and his father's mother lived in Australia. When Richard tried to probe his parents about his background, they were never forthcoming. Did the Feeneys have something to hide, she wondered. It seemed more than likely that they did. Gladys Feeney was very surprised to find Chantelle standing at her door. "Come in, dear. This is a lovely surprise. I never expected to see you. Where is Richard?" "He's at work. It's you I've come to see." "Where is Derek?" "Oh, he's not here, Chantelle. He's gone fishing with his friend Hunter." "Is that a problem? Did you need to speak to him as well?" "No, you'll do fine," said Chantelle nervously. "Come in, dear. I'll make you a nice hot cup of tea. I do so happen to have a delicious carrot cake on offer that I made over the weekend." "That sounds lovely," said Chantelle. "I love carrot cake. It's my absolute favourite." Chantelle watched her mother-in-law lay a tray with her fancy Royal Doulton china. The old woman's arthritic hands were trembling as she placed the teapot and cups on the tray, and led Chantelle into the living room. "Would you like sugar in your tea, dear?" "Thanks, Elaine. 2 teaspoons would be great." Elaine Feeney was always immaculately turned out every single day of the week. Today she was wearing a smart tweed skirt with a cream blouse, a small string of pearls, and her grey hair was swept back in a modern, very stylish hairstyle that was very becoming on her. It would seem that Mrs. Feeney looked at least 10 years younger than her 80 years. Her skin was flawless and peachy, with only a few lines around her eyes. She handed Chantelle her cup of tea, her fingers wobbling precariously as she placed it on the side table, and then handed her a delectable slice of carrot cake. "You must excuse me, my dear," she apologised. "These days my fingers always shake. I'm told it's this dreadful arthritis of mine. Let me tell you something, Elaine. Ageing is not for the faint-hearted." "You look great for your age, Elaine. If I look like you at 80, I'll be one happy woman, I assure you. And as for this carrot cake, it's absolutely delicious," she said, taking a bite. "So lovely and moist, Elaine. I got the recipe from a coffee shop in Ireland when I was visiting there. The owner graciously gave me the recipe because I was from America. If I'd been Irish, she would have definitely refused to give it to me. So tell me, Chantelle, what's on your mind? Why this off-the-cuff spontaneous visit? Not that I'm complaining, of course. It's a pleasure to see you. And with Derek out fishing, I'm very glad of the company. It can get lonely around here sometimes." "I'm sorry to be so indelicate, Elaine, but I need to know. Is Richard adopted?" Elaine's face grew as white as snow. Her fingers began to shake as she rattled the cup in her hand. She looked like a deer caught in headlights. "What makes you ask that, dear?" "Because I've seen his double in our supermarket. I'm not joking, Elaine, but he was identical to Richard in every single way. I mean, it's not possible for a random stranger to be absolutely identical, is it? Other people spotted him with a woman that looked just like me. They thought Richard was having an affair." "You say this man looked identical?" "Identical," said Chantelle. "You can't believe it. I actually went up to him in the supermarket and accused him of being Richard." Elaine's eyes filled with tears. "I think you must have seen Richard's twin brother," she confessed. "So Richard is adopted, then?" Elaine's face remained as white as a sheet. "I gave birth to a beautiful baby boy once in hospital. I brought him back home, but a day or so later I found that he had died in his cot. I was so devastated. My husband, Derek, knew nothing about it at the time. He was away. I put my dead baby in a pram. I walked around the park with him. Can you believe I did that? That was when I saw these mothers in the park, talking. One of the women had twin boys in her pram, and the moment her head was turned, I grabbed one of her babies. I figured out that she had 2 babies. I had none, so I could take one of hers, and that's what I did. Besides, it was clear she didn't want her children." "Oh, my God! You didn't!" gasped Chantelle. "I did," said Elaine. "I know it was wrong." "What did you do with the baby boy, the one that died?" Chantelle asked. "Oh, I took him to the cemetery. I buried him next to my grandmother. No one saw me, and even if they had, they wouldn't have suspected a thing. Babies are very small, you know. It looked like I was planting seedlings, and I planted seedlings as well." "Did Derek know what you'd done?" No, he didn't, dear. Not in the beginning, that is. You see, Richard looked remarkably like my old baby. The likeness was uncanny. He did say that the baby had grown a little, but then you'd expect that. Did they not look for the missing twin? Asked Chantal. I mean, surely there were reports about it in the paper. Nothing. Absolutely nothing, said Elaine. I mean, I took out every paper and there were no reports of a twin being abducted. I was certain I'd be found out, but no one suspected a thing. That's very strange. More than a little bizarre, said Chantal. You'd think the authorities would have kicked up a fuss about the missing twin. Well, I do know the mother was barely a teenager herself. One of the reasons I actually took the baby was because I overheard her groaning to her friends about how she wanted to party all night and wished she didn't have babies. She was going on and on and on about it. One of her friends was saying, "We'll put the kids up for adoption then." She said her parents were laying on the pressure for her to do just that. She constantly complained about how she couldn't stand her own babies. I mean, who does that? That's absolutely dreadful, being raised by a mother who doesn't even want you. I can almost understand why you took one of the babies away, not that it makes it right. What are you going to do? Asked Elaine. Are you going to report me to the police? You can if you want. I've had to live with what I've done all my life. I'm prepared to take responsibility, to face the music. Look, Richard loves you very much. If I did that to his own parents, he wouldn't be particularly happy with me. He's grown up now. You're an 80-year-old woman, far too old to become a jailbird in my book. This abduction took place over 50 long years ago. 1966. That's a long, long time ago. And no reports about the incident in the newspaper. Although it doesn't mean what you did was ethical. And by the sounds of things, Richard's mother didn't even want her twin baby, which might explain why there was no newspaper coverage about it at the time. I'll speak to Richard about it, but I do think he has the right to meet his twin brother. Even his real parents, don't you? What about Derek? Does he know what you did now? He does, said Elaine. I couldn't keep it from him any more. I broke down one day, told him absolutely everything I'd done. By that stage he loved Richard as his own son. So, well, let's just say we decided to keep him. No one suspected a thing, as I keep telling you. Everybody believed he was my real baby, that I'd delivered at the hospital.
As Chantal drove away in the car that afternoon, after having spent the day with Elaine, she had no idea how she was going to deal with this rather delicate situation. She needed to tell Richard everything. By all accounts, the news that he'd been abducted by his own mother from a young teenage girl's pram, whom had never really actually wanted him, would hardly be easy on the ear. But he certainly deserved to know the truth. Chantal decided to stop over at the local bakery in town to buy some pecan nut pie. She knew it was Richard's all-time favourite treat. She hoped that the sweet sugar would lessen the cruel blow of hearing such earth-shattering news. Then she saw him in the baker's, ordering a pecan nut pie himself. It was Richard's identical twin. It was not Richard, as the clothes he was wearing were clearly not Richard's. The Richard look-alike thanked the lady behind the baker's counter for his pecan nut pie, turned around to see Chantal looking directly at him. He frowned. "Not you again. Are you going to reprimand me for dawdling?" "No, not at all," said Chantal. "I'm so sorry about the other day. I really am. I got my wires crossed. I mistook you for someone else. I need to speak to you about something incredibly important. Would you mind having a coffee with me quickly?" The man's frown dissipated. "Why not?" he said, glancing at his watch. "I've got a few minutes to spare." "Thank you. I do appreciate it," said Chantal. "Would cappuccino suit you?" "That's lovely," said the man. When Chantal was sitting down, she opened her cell phone and handed a picture to the man. "Look at that photograph. Notice anything about it?" The man frowned. "Who is this?" he said, staring at Chantal with an expression of bewilderment on his face. "This man looks exactly like me, but it's not me." "He does, doesn't he?" laughed Chantal. "Now you know why I told you to stop dawdling. I thought you were my husband. He's the splitting image of you. Sorry, I didn't get your name." "My name is James Black." "James, I don't mean to be nosy, but can I ask you a little bit about your childhood? Were you raised by a teenage mother?"
Were you possibly a twin? Well, I was born a twin, said James. My twin brother died of SIDS. Well, that's what my mother told me. My mother never wanted me. She treated me like shit. Told me I'd ruined her life. She wished I was dead like my twin brother. That was never easy to hear. She had me very young, you see. She was only 16 when I was born. So after I was 10, I spent my life being dumped from one foster home to another. It was a tough, grueling childhood, one I would sooner forget.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
What if I were to tell you that I believe that my husband might be your twin brother? I think your mother made up the SIDS part. You see, my husband's mother admitted to me yesterday that she had abducted a twin baby, a twin boy from a pram, especially after hearing the young woman droning on about how she wished she wasn't lumbered with babies so young. Well, I wouldn't be surprised. So, I have a twin brother that's alive.
I think so. But before I confirm any of this with my husband or tell him about this, I'd like to run a DNA test on the both of you.
Of course. Sounds like a good idea. It also sounds like your husband got the better deal. I wish I'd escaped the wrath of my mother. Women like her don't deserve to have children.
Did she go on to have any other children?
Good grief, no. She had her tubes tied as soon as she possibly could.
Suffice to say, it had indeed been difficult to tell Richard that his parents weren't his own. Despite the fact that he had been abducted, he had been the lucky one to escape a childhood being raised in a loveless environment by a teenage girl, and spending the rest of his life being dumped from one foster family to another. Chantal had been surprised by Richard's calm response to her mind-blowing revelations that she thought would distress him. I think I've always known deep down in my gut that my parents weren't my own. I don't know how I've known it, but I just have. You sense these things, you know. But how can you be sure that this James Black is in fact my twin brother? I wouldn't have gone to all this trouble if I hadn't had your DNA tested against James's, and there's 100% probability that you're identical twins. In other words, there's no doubt that you are, said Chantal, bringing out the DNA report from her purse and handing it over for Richard to examine. James is very excited to meet you. I've told him all about you.
This is bloody crazy. This says 100%. I have a twin brother, said Richard, breaking out into a jubilant smile. I've always wanted a brother.
Well, I've organised everything. Your brother James wants to meet you on the Pacific Trail. He's one of these types that finds it a lot easier to walk and talk. He wants to meet you in the late afternoon, when most of the dog walkers have left the area. He suggests you bring a head torch, but he said if you don't like the dark, then he's happy to meet you first thing in the morning, but he likes to go when there's no one around. Which would you prefer?
The evening will be fine.
Richard's account. Since I was a young boy, I always sensed I was actually adopted. Although I found out I wasn't really adopted, I was abducted. You get a sense about these things, you know. My parents were very evasive about our family history. It didn't bother me to think that I might be adopted. I grew up with amazing parents who loved the bones of me. I couldn't have asked for better parents. Of course, my wife's appalling revelations of my being snatched out of a pram by my mother was shocking, but it turned out that being abducted was the best thing that could have happened to me, as by all accounts my twin brother James did not fare so luckily in his childhood. He grew up in an environment where love was in short supply, so I think a touch of serendipity was almost certainly on my side, although I don't condone abduction in any way. It was hard to fathom I had a brother. I do remember growing up as a young boy. I longed to have a brother. To think that all the time I actually did was rather extraordinary. I had mixed reservations about meeting someone that looked identical to me. I was thankful that James had asked to meet me in the woodgrove, as the idea of meeting him over coffee would be ever so awkward, but walking with him in nature was infinitely more appealing to me. It already seemed like we had much in common. I particularly loved the woodgrove that was accessible to all the locals in our area, which was outside Portland, and the trail was accessed through a farmer's field, not very well known by outsiders, as it had never been marked on the map.
It would seem during the day the trail was quite busy with walkers and people taking their dogs for an afternoon stroll. But the moment the day drew to a close and the sun set over the escarpment, you could guarantee the place would become dead. I glanced briefly at my watch. It was 5:30. It seemed I was the only car parked on the side of the road, which suggested my brother James had not arrived yet. In truth, I was rather pleased about this. I took my rucksack out of my trunk and put my headlamp on my head. I opened the hiker's gate and trudged through the field until I reached the carnivorous forest, composed primarily of Douglas firs, spruces, hemlocks and ponderosa pines, although there were, of course, a scattering of oaks throughout the forest. A nice eclectic mix, so to speak. Many that were mature and towered high in the sky, rather like verdant skyscrapers. The sun was setting over the trees in a dazzling kaleidoscope of oranges, tangerines, golds, yellows and pinks. There was a gentle breeze blowing through the forest, nudging my face with its cool waves of fresh air, almost as if a fan was blowing directly on my face. The trees began to sway gently. Their needled boughs jiggled in the wind, almost as if they too were twitching nervously, reflecting the rising level of angst I was feeling. I could discern an obscure hazy figure in the distance, running through the field to the edge of the forest. At first he looked like a tiny speck on the horizon that loomed closer and closer and closer, and then I saw him as he made his approach. There we stood, standing yards away from each other, staring gormlessly at one another. It was the weirdest, most surreal experience of my entire life, to be seeing someone in the flesh, identical to myself. Not sure I liked staring at myself like this. It made me fully aware of all my flaws that I could see reflected back at me in the figure staring at me, the square jawline, the boyish face, the brown eyes, the feathery brown eyebrows, the long slender legs, the golden skin, the grey hair. James thankfully broke the silence. "This is weird. We're identical. It's a bit creepy, I know, staring at oneself like this. Do you think we're completely identical?" "I hope not," I said. "It would be nice to think we had some discerning differences." "You won't have this," he said, rolling up his sleeves proudly. "I got the scar when I fell off a bike. I was 10 years old at the time." Seeing James's scar sent chills running up my spine, as I rolled up my sleeve to show him my scar. Granted, they weren't exactly the same, but they did look eerily similar. "That's freaky," said James. "You have a scar not unsimilar to mine. What happened there?" "I fell off a tree when I was 10, I told him. "Let's go for a walk," said James. "If you don't mind, I would prefer not to be staring at myself. I've never enjoyed looking at myself in the mirror, so staring at you is rarely rather unnerving." "I feel exactly the same way," I assured him. "Looking at you reminds me of how grey I've become." "Thanks a bunch," laughed James. "I still think we look remarkably young for our age because of our boyish faces. I believe if we dyed our hair brown, people would think we were in our late 30s. It's our boyish faces. It makes us look very much younger than the average person." As we walked in the woodgrove and talked, I realised how much me and James had in common. We were both married with 2 children that had left home. He had grown up in Portland and was raised by the most appalling mother, who was tirelessly complaining about what a nuisance it was to have a kid, and threatening to have him handed over to the social services if he didn't behave himself. Eventually she did just that. He had never met his father, as his mother was so promiscuous there was no way of knowing who he was, which was a sobering thought, because he could have been anybody. James was married to a woman called Hilda, who looked a lot like my wife. I was to discover that he was an architect like myself, who had recently moved to the area only 4 weeks ago. I mean, what were the chances of that happening? James had come well equipped with his hiking equipment, and after we had walked a long way, we took our seats on the earthen floor, while James opened up his bag, pulled out some chilled white wine, a couple of glasses, sausage rolls, ham and cheese sandwiches, avocado and tuna sandwiches, cheese quiche, chips, chocolate brownies and peanuts. He spread out a picnic blanket on the ground and lit up a portable kerosene lamp. He handed me a paper plate and poured me a glass of wine.
"This looks delicious, James. I must say you've excelled yourself. I've never thought of a picnic at night in the middle of the wood grove. It really is rather enchanting, is it not?" "Oh, there's nothing like it, bro," said James. "Food always tastes so much better eaten al fresco. I eat it like this at every opportunity." We sat down under a large oak tree, talked, drank wine and ate, although in truth I hadn't eaten much. I kept getting this airy feeling I was being watched all the time, but I thought I must be imagining things. I glanced down at my sandwiches and was surprised to see most of them were gone. Had James eaten them off my plate, I wondered, choosing to say nothing, and reaching out for a few more sandwiches to replace the ones that James must have accidentally taken off my plate. I do not know how long we sat there under the oak tree, listening to the sounds of the crickets and frogs, and the occasional wails and calls of a coyote. But the night was magical, and James's company engaging and convivial. It must have been about 2 o'clock in the morning. Yes, we were out there that long in the forest, when it suddenly just changed. I heard a strange voice breaking the silence. It had called out in the night, sounding like someone calling a person's name, but the voice appeared muffled and distant. In that moment, everything in the forest changed. It was like the nightly conductor that initiates the singing of the crickets and frogs had silenced his celestial orchestra, while the sounds of the distant coyotes seemed to cooperate with this momentary reprieve, for their calls also dissipated, evaporating like the steamy vapour from a kettle, until they were no more. If the forest had indeed been a film set, then without a shadow of a doubt the actors had been undisputably told to pack up everything and to go home for the evening. You would rightly assume all the electrics had been disconnected. The leaf-blower machine, for example, had been switched off, so that the cool breeze that had pleasantly been blowing all evening stopped whisking up the leaves. The trees stood rigidly still. Not even a lone branch jiggled in the wind, nor did a single leaf stir up on the forest floor, as nothing dared to move, as everything was held hostage to the ominous sound of silence that was so pronounced you could hear a pin drop. The sounds of the forest were now abandoned and estranged.
"Weird," said James. "I wonder why it's so quiet all of a sudden." Then we heard the voice again. It sounded like it was saying, "Atuha! Atuha! Atuha!" Then we heard the thumping sound, as if heavy footfall was stomping through the forest. "Atuha!" came the voice again. "Atuha!" "Someone's coming," said James. It was the weirdest thing, because the voice sounded human, but the footfall was ponderous, as if something hefty and sizable and really Herculean was moving towards us. James and I heard twigs cracking, and then we saw a tree swaying on its own accord, as if something was deliberately shaking it. Then we saw her. I was so astonished and confounded, I thought I was going to pass out from the shock. It was a Bigfoot, and a female one at that. She was titanically huge, 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, with small pert breasts, covered in long flowing dark hair that was a jet black colour. She had a distinctive pyramid-shaped head, and a very human face, with a feminine look about it. Then she moved towards us. I was so terrified I wanted the ground to swallow me whole. Was she going to harm us, I wondered? Then there she was, yards away from us, so close to us, in fact, that I could hear her breathing. She sounded exactly like a horse. "Atua! Atua! Atua!" she called, looking directly up the oak tree we were sitting underneath. And sure enough, sliding down the tree, rather like a fireman's pole, with an effortless, masterful precision, rather like an acrobat, was a skinny little 3-foot Bigfoot, who looked exceedingly sheepish and bashful. The mother Bigfoot pretty much ignored us, but kept chattering away at her son, often referring to him as Atua. She sounded like a belligerent mother. She continued to chatter and chatter at her child, as if giving him a lecture. Then she yanked him by his overlong arm, pulling him in front of her. He looked as if he'd been chastised for his insolent disobedience. He hung his head in shame, his brown mischievous eyes not daring to look at his mother's. She turned around to give us a polite nod. Then she vanished into the forest with her son placed in front of her, as if she was determined not to let him out of her sight. I got the distinct impression he was always getting up to bountiful mischief, and she had had quite enough, like any fatigued, exasperated mother who'd been worn out by their child's nonsensical shenanigans. I was so gobsmacked, I looked at James and said, "Did that really happen?" He nodded. "It did, bro." Then we looked down at our picnic and discovered every last morsel of food had disappeared. We both laughed out loud, knowing that the clever little Bigfoot had ingeniously stolen all our food. Ostensibly the sandwiches that I'd mistakenly thought that James had stolen off my plate had surreptitiously been taken away by a sneaky pair of little hands by a very naughty little Bigfoot, and we hadn't seen a thing. I think the two great illusionist magicians, Penn and Teller, would have done exceedingly well to take pointers from this crafty, wily, artful little Bigfoot, for he pinched almost our entire picnic without us detecting a thing. To cut a long story short, over the years, me and James became very close brothers, my wife and his wife the very best of friends. My mother never got into trouble for abducting me. I mean, why would I treacherously betray the woman who saved me from an atrocious, callous, loveless life? The life my brother James was forced to embrace. It would seem I had a miraculous escape. Over the years, me and my brother, along with our wives, have gone on a plethora of camping holidays together. To date, we never encountered another Bigfoot. I did go and visit the woman who gave birth to me. She was the most appalling woman I have ever met, without exaggeration. She took one look at me and said, "Oh, you're alive then. Thank God I didn't have to bring you up as well. One was quite enough. I told everyone you died of SIDS and that you were buried at the cemetery, and they believed me. No one gave a toss." On a final note, I think it's incredible, given James' infelicious, wretched upbringing, that he turned out to be such a decent man. To date, I've never been more grateful for being abducted. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.